The morning of October 17th, 1943, dawned clear over Kahili airfield at the southern tip of Bougainville. 24 bent-winged Vought F4U Corsairs circled high above the Japanese base, their massive Pratt and Whitney engines rumbling like distant thunder. Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, 31 years old and already a combat veteran from his time with the Flying Tigers in China, led his Marine Fighter Squadron 214, the Black Sheep. Below them, 60 Japanese aircraft sat on the airfield, and Boyington had come to do something that seemed suicidal. He was going to make them come up and fight. For the pilots strapping into those Corsair cockpits that morning, this wasn't bravado. It was calculated aggression born from a simple truth that American naval aviators had learned the hard way over 20 months of brutal combat. The Mitsubishi A6M0 could turn tighter than anything in the Pacific. It could climb faster from equal altitude. Its pilots, men like Saburo Sakai and Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, had thousands of hours and dozens of kills. But the Corsair had something the Zero didn't: raw, overwhelming power. And American pilots were finally learning how to use it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When Pearl Harbor exploded into war in December 1941, the US Navy and Marine Corps had been dying in alarming numbers. The F-4F Wildcat was outmatched in nearly every performance category by the Zero. Early carrier battles at Coral Sea and Midway showed just how deadly the mismatch could be. Some squadrons lost half their pilots in a single engagement. The mathematics were brutal and simple. If the Zero could dictate the terms of engagement, American pilots would keep dying. The Corsair that rolled off Chance Vaught's assembly lines in late 1942 was supposed to change that equation. Rex Beisel and his engineering team had created something that looked almost alien compared to conventional fighters. The inverted gull wing, designed to give clearance for a massive 13-foot 4-inch diameter propeller, gave the aircraft its distinctive profile. That propeller was driven by an 18-cylinder, 2,000 horsepower R2800 double Wasp radial engine, the same power plant that would later drive the Hellcat, 650 caliber machine guns, an airframe that could absorb punishment that would shred a Zero. But here's what nobody fully understood yet in early 1943, as those first Corsairs arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal with VMF 124. Raw performance specs don't win dogfights. The Corsair was faster, true. It could dive away from trouble and had armor protection that felt like flying a bank vault compared to the fragile Zero. But it was heavier, less maneuverable in the horizontal plane, and still facing those same veteran Japanese aces who'd been perfecting their craft for years. The question that haunted every Marine Squadron commander wasn't whether the Corsair was better than the Wildcat, it was whether it was good enough to beat the Zero, and more importantly, whether Marine pilots could figure out how to use it before the casualty lists grew even longer. Because on February 14th, 1943, they got their answer, and it wasn't the one they wanted. The mission that became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre started like any other bomber escort. Marine Corsairs from VMF 124 escorted Army B-24 Liberators toward Japanese positions over Bougainville. What followed was a masterclass in how not to fight Zeros with a new aircraft you didn't fully understand. Japanese pilots, led by experienced aces from the 204th Kokutai, tore through the formation. 9 American aircraft went down. Only 1 Zero was lost, and that happened when Lieutenant Gordon Lyon Jr.'s Corsair collided with it mid-air. Both pilots died. It was the first confirmed kill ever attributed to a Corsair, and it had required ramming the enemy aircraft. The after-action reports made for grim reading at Marine Corps Aviation Headquarters. Corsair pilots had tried to turn with the Zeros. They'd attempted to fight the enemy's fight, to engage in the swirling horizontal dogfights that Japanese pilots had been trained for since flight school, and they'd been slaughtered for it. One of the pilots who survived that day, Captain James Sweat, wrote in his debriefing, "We tried to match them turn for turn. That's suicide. The Zero will outturn anything we have. We need a different approach." For the next 2 months, Corsair combat results were subdued. Pilots were learning, But the learning curve was written in blood. Intelligence officers studying gun camera footage and debriefing survivors started noticing patterns. When Corsairs engaged Zeros in turning fights below 15,000 feet, loss rates were unacceptable. But when pilots maintained altitude advantage and made slashing high-speed attacks, results improved dramatically. The problem was convincing combat pilots to change decades of fighter doctrine that emphasized maneuverability and sustained turning performance. The Corsair's engineering gave pilots options that the Zero simply could not match. The R2800 engine produced not just raw horsepower, but excess power, energy that could be converted into altitude or speed at the pilot's discretion. The aircraft could reach speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour in level flight. That's more than 60 miles per hour faster than the Zero's maximum speed. In a dive, with gravity assisting that massive engine, the Corsair could approach 500 miles per hour while maintaining full control authority. Testing at Naval Air Station Patuxent River through spring and summer of 1943 quantified what a few combat pilots were discovering instinctively. A Corsair at 15,000 feet could accelerate to 425 knots in a vertical dive while maintaining full control. The aircraft could pull out of these dives starting as low as 3,000 feet with proper technique, a maneuver that would generate approximately 5.5 Gs, right at the edge of human tolerance, but well within the Corsair's structural limits. The aircraft was rated for 7.5 G positive loads. Compare that to the Zero's approximately 5 G structural limit before risking catastrophic failure. The Corsair could maneuver in three-dimensional space that enemy aircraft literally couldn't enter without breaking apart. Japanese test pilot Saburo Sakai wrote after the war that diving through 350 knots made the Zero's controls feel like they were embedded in concrete and that high-speed pullouts generated forces that were borderline unmanageable. Several Zero pilots died attempting to follow Corsairs into vertical maneuvers, their aircraft literally disintegrating from structural overload. More importantly, the Corsair's climb performance changed tactical thinking. From sea level, a Corsair could reach 10,000 feet in just under 4 minutes at combat power. That meant a pilot could execute a high-speed diving attack, convert his excess speed back into altitude, and be ready for another pass before the enemy formation could reorganize. It was energy management in its purest form. Potential energy becoming kinetic energy, becoming potential energy again, a cycle that Japanese fighters couldn't match because their engines simply didn't produce equivalent horsepower. The breakthrough came not from training manuals or tactical doctrine written in Washington. It came from pilots who were breaking the rules and surviving to talk about it. Men who were starting to realize that the best way to beat a Zero wasn't to fight it on its terms. It was to change the fight entirely. To turn air combat from a horizontal chess match into something vertical, something violent, something that happened so fast the enemy couldn't react. By September 1943, when Pappy Boyington took command of VMF 214, the new tactics were beginning to crystallize. Boyington himself had learned harsh lessons during his time with the Flying Tigers in China. He'd seen what happened when pilots tried to turn with Japanese fighters. He'd also seen what worked. Speed, altitude, aggression, never fight the enemy's fight. The Black Sheep Squadron would become his laboratory for refining these principles into a doctrine that would transform Marine Corps aviation. The squadron was cobbled together from replacement pilots and men who'd been rejected by other units, Boyington's misfits. His bastards, though public affairs wouldn't let them use that name, they flew from forward airfields in the Solomon Islands, first from Munda on New Georgia, then from Vella La Vella. Their mission was simple: find Japanese aircraft, kill them, come home, do it again tomorrow. Boyington drilled his pilots relentlessly on vertical tactics. Maintain altitude advantage. Always. If you're not above the enemy, you're already losing. Never descend to their altitude to engage. That's their world. Your world is 5,000 feet above them, watching, waiting, choosing your moment. When you dive through them, not at them, through them. You're a bullet fired from altitude. Fire your guns in that brief window when you pass through their formation. 2 seconds, 3 at most. Then keep diving. Use that speed to separate. Climb back to altitude using all that excess energy your engine can provide. Reset. Do it again. The geometry was brutally simple. A Corsair at 20,000 feet had stored energy in the form of altitude. That pilot could roll into a dive, typically at 60 to 70 degrees, and let gravity do most of the work. The R2800 engine simply maintained acceleration as airspeed built past 400 knots. The pilot wasn't forcing the aircraft to dive, he was allowing it to fall with purpose, guiding it toward a specific point in space where the enemy would be when he arrived. For a Zero pilot watching from below, that translated to a threat approaching at roughly 680 feet per second. The human eye can track movement, but the brain needs time to process threat vectors and formulate responses. That processing time is roughly 0.7 of a second for threat recognition and basic reaction. By the time a Japanese pilot's hand started moving toward his control stick, the Corsair had already closed 476 feet and was entering gun range. The enemy had perhaps 2 seconds in the firing envelope, just enough time for a 1-second burst from all 650 caliber guns. That's roughly 80 rounds total. But at a closing speed of 600 feet per second, it was like firing into a stationary target. What made this revolutionary wasn't the dive itself. Pilots had been making diving attacks since World War I. It was diving through the formation and continuing downward rather than trying to pull up and dogfight. Your instinct, your training, everything screamed at you to pull up after firing and engage. That's what fighter pilots did. That's what every tactical manual taught, but that's also what got pilots killed. Because the moment you tried to turn with a Zero at his altitude, you lost every advantage the Corsair gave you. The breakthrough was psychological as much as tactical. You had to trust the aircraft, trust the massive R2800 engine to convert your speed back into altitude. Trust the airframe to handle the G-forces of pulling out at the bottom of the dive. Trust that when you pointed the nose back up at 50 degrees and firewalled the throttle, you'd climb back to 20,000 feet faster than the Zeros could follow. Trust that you were fighting a completely different war than they were. October 17th, 1943. Pappy Boyington and his 24 Corsairs circled over Kahili airfield, visible to every Japanese pilot and gunner on the base. They wanted to be seen. The plan was to goad the enemy into sending up as many fighters as possible and then demonstrate, conclusively, that vertical tactics worked. Boyington positioned his squadron between the Japanese base and the sun. Classic fighter doctrine: attack out of the sun. But he added an altitude advantage that made the sun position almost irrelevant. The Black Sheep were 8,000 feet above the airfield, high enough that the Japanese fighters would have to climb to engage, high enough that Boyington's pilots could see everything developing below them. The Japanese took the bait. Fighters began launching from Kahili, Zeros, mostly, some Army Key 43 Oscars. Approximately 40 aircraft scrambled to meet the Marine fighters. The odds were nearly 2-1 against the Americans. In a traditional turning fight, those odds would be suicidal. In a vertical fight with altitude advantage, they were acceptable. Boyington keyed his radio and gave the order. Individual pilots select targets. Maintain altitude separation. No one goes below 10,000 feet. If you get slow, disengage and climb. We fight our fight. What followed was a masterclass in energy management. Corsairs dove, fired, and climbed. Dove, fired, climbed. Again and again. Japanese pilots tried to climb to engage but could never close the altitude gap. Every time they thought they had a Corsair in range, it was diving away at 430 miles per hour, completely untouchable. Some Zero pilots, more aggressive or perhaps more desperate, tried to follow the Corsairs into dives. Their aircraft shook violently as control surfaces stiffened at high speeds. Some pulled out successfully, gasping for breath after 6G pullouts that grayed their vision and left them disoriented. Others didn't pull out. Their wings folded under stress that exceeded design limits. The engagement lasted approximately 30 minutes. When it ended, 20 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 0 American losses. Boyington's squadron returned to Vella La Vella intact. Intelligence officers initially had trouble believing the combat reports. A 20-0 kill ratio in a single engagement against veteran Japanese pilots, it seemed impossible. But gun camera footage confirmed it. Debriefings from all 24 pilots told the same story. They'd maintained altitude, they'd used vertical attacks, they'd refused to engage in turning fights, and the Japanese pilots, flying superior turning aircraft, had been unable to touch them. The tactics shattered something fundamental in how Japanese pilots understood air combat. Since the opening days of the war, Zero pilots had been trained in a doctrine that emphasized tight turns, energy conservation through efficient movement, and exploiting the Zero's superior agility. Every engagement began with the assumption that combat would occur in the horizontal plane, with victory going to the pilot who could position himself on an enemy's tail through superior turning. When Corsairs started appearing from directly overhead at speeds that seemed physically impossible, diving through formations and disappearing before anyone could react, it violated every assumption Japanese pilots had spent years internalizing. Captured documents from late 1943, particularly training materials recovered from Rabaul, showed Japanese instructors struggling to develop counter-tactics. One manual, translated by Marine Intelligence, instructed pilots to maintain constant vigilance above and to never assume the sky above 16,000 feet is empty. That sounds like reasonable advice until you understand what it demands. A pilot engaged in combat operates on limited cognitive bandwidth. There's only so much your brain can process while flying at 300 miles per hour, monitoring instruments, tracking multiple aircraft, and managing your own energy state. Forcing pilots to constantly check above them meant dividing attention that was already stretched thin. And even if you spotted a Corsair at 20,000 feet, what exactly were you supposed to do about it? You couldn't climb fast enough to challenge him before he dove. You couldn't maintain a defensive weave indefinitely while still prosecuting attacks on American bombers. The attacks from above also exploited a basic limitation of human vision and situational awareness. The human eye's effective field of view is roughly 120 degrees horizontally, but only about 90 degrees vertically. And that's when you're deliberately looking up, when you're focused on threats at your altitude, which is where every previous combat engagement had occurred. Your effective vertical awareness drops to perhaps 45 degrees. Marine pilots learned to initiate dives from positions that were literally outside the enemy's visual range until it was too late. You were invisible until the moment of attack, and by then the geometry made evasion nearly impossible. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences, described the tactical hopelessness. We could see them above us, sitting there like hawks. We knew they would dive. We knew we could not follow them when they did. And we knew that when they climbed back to altitude, they would dive again. We were not fighting pilots. We were fighting gravity. And you cannot outmaneuver gravity. That sense of helplessness was exactly what American tacticians had been trying to create. By late 1943, training syllabi at Marine Corps air stations were explicitly teaching pilots to maximize the psychological impact of vertical attacks. Instructions included using cloud cover to mask your altitude position, timing attacks to coincide with moments when enemy formations were most vulnerable during turns or altitude changes, and always maintaining enough energy to climb back to attacking position. The goal wasn't just to shoot down aircraft. It was to make Japanese pilots understand that every second they stayed airborne, there could be a threat above them they couldn't see and couldn't counter. Flight operations data from Japanese squadrons in late 1943 showed a measurable decline in aggressive tactics. Pilots were becoming more defensive, more hesitant, spending more time checking their 6 o'clock and their 12 o'clock high. They were being hunted, and they knew it. The Corsairs' advantage wasn't just mechanical, it was systematic. American industrial capacity meant that when a Corsair was shot down, another rolled off the production line to replace it. By the end of 1943, Chance Vought, Goodyear, and Brewster were producing Corsairs faster than Japan could destroy them. When an American pilot was lost, another came out of the training pipeline at Pensacola or Jacksonville or Corpus Christi. Well-trained, fresh, aggressive, when Japan lost an experienced pilot like those defending Rabaul, that pilot was irreplaceable. The deep bench of pre-war aviators who'd honed their skills over China was being systematically destroyed, and the replacement pilots showing up at forward bases had perhaps 50 flying hours and minimal combat training. They were lambs sent to slaughter against Marine pilots who were refining their vertical tactics with every mission. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematics were inexorable. America was winning a war of attrition in the air, and the Corsair was the instrument of that victory. January 3rd, 1944, started like any combat day for Pappy Boyington. Pre-dawn briefing, weather check, aircraft inspection. What it became was a single mission that would cement Boyington's place in Marine Corps history and demonstrate both the effectiveness and the risks of aggressive fighter tactics. Boyington led a sweep of 48 American fighters, including 4 planes from the Black Sheep Squadron, over Rabaul, the most heavily defended Japanese base in the South Pacific. He'd already tied World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker's record of 26 kills. One more would make him the leading American ace. One more would prove that the kid from Washington who'd been kicked out of the Flying Tigers and nearly court-martialed multiple times in the Marines was the best fighter pilot in the Pacific. The formation arrived over Rabaul at 800 hours. Below them, Simpson Harbor crawled with Japanese shipping. The sky was filled with defensive fighters. Boyington didn't hesitate. He rolled his Corsair into a dive and attacked. Within minutes, he'd destroyed 1-0, then another, 28 kills, the new American record. His wingman called warnings about more zeros closing from above. Boyington acknowledged but continued attacking. This was his element. This was what the Corsair was built for. Vertical combat at high speed where Japanese fighters couldn't match him. Then something changed. Multiple zeros converged on Boyington's position. His wingman was forced to break off to defend himself. Boyington found himself alone, swarmed by enemy fighters, with machine gun rounds zipping around his Corsair from every direction. He kept fighting, kept firing, kept maneuvering, but there were too many. A zero strafed him from above. Rounds tore through his Corsair's cockpit and engine. Bullets and shrapnel hit Boyington in the head, shoulder, and leg. His engine caught fire. Smoke filled the cockpit. The Corsair was dying. Boyington pushed the stick forward and dove. His only option was to get to the water. Get out. Hope someone saw him go down. The Corsair hit the Pacific Ocean at high speed. Boyington was thrown clear of the wreckage, wounded, bleeding, floating in enemy-controlled waters. He was picked up hours later by the Japanese submarine I-181. For the next 20 months, Pappy Boyington was a prisoner of war. Back home, he was presumed dead. President Franklin Roosevelt posthumously awarded him the Medal of Honor. The Black Sheep Squadron was disbanded. The legend had apparently ended, except Boyington wasn't dead. He survived Japanese prisoner of war camps through sheer stubbornness and the same aggressive refusal to quit that had made him a fighter ace. When he was finally liberated in August 1945, emaciated but alive, he returned to the United States, a national hero. The Medal of Honor he'd been posthumously awarded was presented to him by President Harry Truman in October 1945. His final tally stood at 28 confirmed kills, the Marine Corps' leading ace of World War II. But Boyington's story, as dramatic as it was, represented only a small piece of the larger tactical revolution the Corsair had enabled. Between 1943 and 1945, Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons achieved a kill-to-loss ratio of 11-1 against Japanese aircraft. That's more than 2,000 enemy aircraft destroyed against fewer than 200 Corsairs lost in air-to-air combat. The Corsair had the lowest attrition rate of any fighter in the Pacific theater. Those numbers seemed impossible back in early 1943 when the St. Valentine's Day massacre demonstrated that the aircraft alone wasn't enough. But tactics had evolved, doctrine had been refined, and vertical energy management had become the foundation of American fighter operations. The broader impact extended beyond individual engagements. Marine Corsair squadrons pioneered close air support tactics that would become standard doctrine for decades. Following the battle for Tarawa in November 1943, where supporting Navy pilots had no means of communicating with ground troops, the Marine Corps recognized a need to establish a direct line between infantry and Corsair pilots. They created air liaison parties, dismounted aviators embedded with infantry units who could speak directly to low-flying Corsair pilots and help direct ordnance precisely where needed. This innovation paved the way for modern joint terminal attack controllers. Corsairs flew close air support missions at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, demonstrating that the aircraft wasn't just an air superiority fighter. It was a versatile weapons platform that could deliver bombs and rockets with accuracy that ground commanders had never experienced before. The nickname Whistling Death, supposedly given by Japanese troops who heard the distinctive sound of air rushing through the Corsair's oil coolers during high-speed dives, became synonymous with inevitable destruction from above. The Corsair's combat record validated fundamental principles about fighter design and employment that influenced American aviation for generations. Speed and structural strength could overcome maneuverability disadvantages if tactics were properly developed. Altitude translated directly to tactical advantage. Energy management, the ability to convert potential energy to kinetic energy and back again, was more important than sustained turn performance. And aggressive, well-trained pilots, given the right tools, would find ways to exploit those tools that engineers and tacticians never imagined. The aircraft remained in production longer than any other piston-engine fighter from World War II. When the war ended in August 1945, the Corsair didn't retire. It flew throughout the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, providing close air support and even achieving air-to-air kills against Soviet MiG-15 jets. Marine Corsair pilot Lieutenant Guy Bordelon became the only Navy ace of the Korean War by shooting down 5 enemy aircraft at night, the only ace of that war to make all his kills in a propeller airplane. The last military Corsair wasn't retired until 1979, serving with Honduras 37 years after the type first entered combat. The vertical attack doctrine that Corsair pilots perfected became encoded in American fighter training programs and passed down through generations who never flew a piston-engine aircraft. When the Navy established the Fighter Weapons School at Naval Air Station Miramar in 1969, the program that became famous as Top Gun, the very first tactical manual included a section on energy management in vertical maneuvering. The language was updated for jet aircraft, the speeds were higher, but the core concept was identical to what Pappy Boyington had proven over Rabaul 25 years earlier. Maintain altitude advantage, convert it to speed during attack, refuse engagements where the enemy holds positional superiority. Korea provided the first test of these principles in jet combat. When Navy Corsairs and Grumman Panthers faced Soviet-built MiG-15 seconds starting in 1950, the performance mismatch looked disturbingly familiar to veterans who remembered facing Zeros. The MiG could outturn American fighters and had superior climb rate at high altitude, but Navy pilots had institutional knowledge preserved through Corsair veterans who'd become instructors. They fought vertically, using speed to compensate for the enemy's maneuverability advantage, never staying at the enemy's preferred fighting altitude. The doctrine's influence became even more apparent in Vietnam. Early in that conflict, from 1965 through 1967, Navy F-4 Phantom crews maintained significantly better kill ratios than their Air Force counterparts by fighting vertically and managing energy. This performance gap directly led to the creation of Top Gun. The curriculum explicitly studied World War II Pacific combat reports, particularly the tactical evolution from 1943 to 1945. Instructor pilots required students to read after-action reports from Corsair squadrons. The lessons were stark. Technology alone doesn't win dogfights. Understanding your aircraft's strengths relative to the enemy's does. Every modern, American fighter tactic carries DNA from the Corsair's vertical attack doctrine. The F-15 Eagle's entire design philosophy, high thrust-to-weight ratio, phenomenal climb rate, powerful radar for long-range detection, optimizes for fighting vertically and maintaining energy advantage. The F-22 Raptor's supercruise capability, allowing sustained supersonic flight without afterburner, exists specifically to maintain the energy state advantage that Corsair pilots called an altitude bank. Even modern aerial combat training emphasizes the same principles that Boyington and his Black Sheep codified in 1943. The terminology has changed. Pilots now talk about rate fights versus radius fights and specific excess power. But the underlying physics is identical. Fight your fight, not theirs. Use physics as a weapon. Turn engineering advantages into tactical supremacy. Those insights transcended the specific aircraft and became the foundation of how America trains fighter pilots. Every aviator who's passed through Miramar, every F-16 pilot who's learned energy management, every F-35 driver who studies vertical tactics is flying a doctrine refined over the Pacific Ocean 8 decades ago, by pilots who learned that sometimes the best way forward is straight down at 430 miles per hour. The Corsairs' legacy isn't just about numbers, though the 11-to-1 kill ratio speaks for itself. It's about the fundamental shift in thinking that the aircraft enabled. Before the Corsair, American fighter doctrine was largely defensive. Survive the enemy's attacks, try to achieve parity, hope that superior numbers would eventually prevail. The Corsair, properly employed, transformed that thinking. Now doctrine was offensive. Dictate the terms of engagement, force the enemy to fight your battle, use every advantage your aircraft provides, and refuse to engage where those advantages don't apply. That aggressive mindset, that refusal to fight the enemy's fight, became characteristic of American fighter aviation. It's why American pilots achieved air superiority in every conflict from World War II through the present. Not because American aircraft were always the most maneuverable, though often they were competitive, but because American doctrine emphasized using whatever advantages existed, whether that was speed, altitude, radar range, missile capability, or simple numerical superiority, to create engagements where victory was likely and defeat was unlikely. The Marines who flew Corsairs over the Solomon Islands, men like Pappy Boyington, Ken Walsh, Robert Hansen, and hundreds of others whose names aren't remembered, learned those lessons through trial and error, through watching friends die when tactics failed, through discovering what worked when pilots were desperate enough to break the rules. They refined those lessons into doctrine, passed them down to the next generation, and created a template for fighter employment that remains valid today. When Boyington circled over Kahili airfield on October 17th, 1943, deliberately goading Japanese pilots into launching and fighting, he wasn't just demonstrating bravery or tactical skill. He was proving that the Corsair, flown correctly, could dominate one of the most feared fighters of World War II. That the bent-wing bird with its massive engine and distinctive silhouette wasn't just another fighter. It was a weapon system that changed the mathematics of air combat in the Pacific. 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed without loss wasn't luck. It was the inevitable result of superior energy management, properly applied. The 11-to-1 kill ratio wasn't achieved through individual heroics, though there was plenty of that. It was achieved through systematic exploitation of engineering advantages that Japanese fighters couldn't match. Through doctrine that turned altitude into attacks and attacks into kills. Through training that emphasized aggression and energy management over traditional dogfighting. Through pilots who understood that their mission wasn't to outturn the enemy, it was to outthink him, outfly him, and use physics as their primary weapon. The whistling sound that gave the Corsair its Japanese nickname, Whistling Death, came from air rushing through the aircraft's oil coolers at high speed during dives. That sound became the last thing hundreds of Japanese pilots heard before 650 caliber machine guns opened fire. It was the acoustic signature of a tactical revolution, the sound of American fighter doctrine being rewritten in real time over the jungles and waters of the South Pacific. But the Corsair's story isn't just about what happened during World War II. It's about what didn't happen, what almost happened. The aircraft nearly failed carrier qualification trials in 1942 because of poor visibility during landing approaches. That long nose, necessary to accommodate the massive R-2800 engine and propeller, blocked the pilot's forward view when the aircraft was in landing configuration. Several test pilots crashed. The Navy rejected the Corsair for carrier operations and gave priority to the Grumman Hellcat instead. The Marines got the Corsair by default, not because anyone thought Marine pilots were better equipped to handle a difficult aircraft, but because the Marines were desperate. They needed something better than the Wildcat, and the Navy didn't want the Corsair, so Marine squadrons got the bent-wing bird and made it work through sheer determination. They operated from land bases in the Solomons, from primitive airfields carved out of jungle, from coral strips that turned to mud in tropical downpours, and they learned to fly it, learned to love it, learned to turn its quirks and difficulties into advantages. The irony is that the Corsair eventually became an excellent carrier aircraft. British Royal Navy pilots figured out the landing technique first, using a curved approach that gave better visibility. American carrier squadrons started operating Corsairs in early 1944, and by war's end, the aircraft was flying from carriers throughout the Pacific. But that initial rejection meant that Marines got first crack at the aircraft, and Marine pilots, operating from forward bases with less support infrastructure than carrier squadrons, developed the aggressive tactics that made the Corsair legendary. What would have happened if the Navy had accepted the Corsair immediately for carrier operations? Would carrier-based pilots have developed the same vertical tactics, or would they have tried to use the Corsair like a Wildcat, fighting horizontal engagements where the Zero's advantages still mattered? There's no way to know. But the historical record suggests that the Marines' land-based operations, their forward deployment, their exposure to the most intense combat, created conditions where tactical innovation wasn't optional. It was survival. The numbers tell part of the story. 12,500 Corsairs were built during and after World War II, more than any other American fighter except the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang. They flew 64,000 operational sorties for the Marines and Navy through the Pacific War, 44% of total fighter sorties, though only 15% were flown from carrier decks. The rest came from land bases, from Marine squadrons that used the Corsair as their primary weapon from early 1943 through war's end. Those squadrons claimed 2,140 air combat victories against 189 losses to enemy aircraft, an overall kill ratio of 11.3 to 1. Against the Zero specifically, the ratio climbed to 12 to 1. Against later Japanese fighters like the Nakajima Ki-84 and Kawanishi N-1K, the ratio was 6 to 1. Even against Japan's best late-war fighters, aircraft that were supposed to counter the American performance advantage, the Corsair maintained decisive superiority. Part of that superiority was the aircraft itself. The R-2800 engine was remarkably reliable. It could lose one or more cylinders to battle damage and continue producing power. Pilots reported flying home on engines that were literally missing chunks of their cylinder banks, oil streaming back over the cockpit, the big radial still turning and making enough thrust to keep the aircraft airborne. The airframe was tough. Corsairs absorbed damage that would have destroyed Zeros or even Hellcats and still brought their pilots home. But durability alone doesn't produce 11 to 1 kill ratios. Tactics do. And the tactics that Marine Corsair pilots developed, refined through hundreds of combat missions over Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Rabaul, and the Northern Solomons, were fundamentally sound. They worked in 1943, they worked in 1944 and 45. They worked in Korea against both propeller-driven aircraft and early jets. And they work today, adapted for modern fighters with modern weapons, but based on the same core principles. The psychological impact on Japanese aviation was measurable and devastating. By mid-1944, after a year of facing Corsairs that attacked from above at speeds that seemed impossible, Japanese fighter pilots were showing signs of what modern psychiatrists would call combat stress reaction. They were hesitant, defensive, more concerned with survival than with aggressive attacks on American bombers. Intelligence reports from captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed a force that knew it was losing and couldn't see any way to reverse the trend. Japanese aviation training had been excellent at the start of the war. Pilots underwent years of instruction, accumulated thousands of flying hours, and emerged as some of the most skilled aviators in the world. But that training system couldn't sustain combat losses. By 1943, Replacement pilots were showing up at forward bases with minimal flight time and virtually no combat training. They were thrown into battle against Marine pilots who had months of experience, who understood their aircraft intimately, who knew exactly how to exploit the Corsairs' advantages. The mathematics were brutal. Every experienced Japanese pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every Corsair pilot lost could be replaced by someone from the training pipeline, someone with hundreds of hours in type, someone who'd been taught the tactics that worked. America's industrial capacity meant replacement aircraft arrived faster than they could be destroyed. America's training infrastructure meant replacement pilots were adequately prepared for combat. Japan had neither advantage. The Corsair didn't just achieve air superiority. It systematically destroyed Japanese aviation as a fighting force. By 1945, Japanese fighter opposition had become sporadic. Not because they didn't have aircraft, though attrition was severe. Not because they didn't have pilots, though experienced aviators were scarce. But because the survivors understood that launching against American formations meant near certain death. Better to conserve forces for the final defense of the home islands. Better to wait for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. Better to avoid combat against Corsairs that dove from altitude at speeds that made engagement suicidal. That's the ultimate measure of tactical superiority. When the enemy refuses to engage because he knows he'll lose. When air superiority becomes so complete that enemy fighters stay on the ground rather than contest your presence. The Corsair, combined with proper tactics and aggressive pilots, achieved that level of dominance. Not through individual heroics, though there were plenty of heroes, but through systematic application of advantages that the enemy couldn't counter. The cost was real. 189 Corsairs lost to enemy aircraft represents 189 American pilots killed, captured, or wounded. Men like Pappy Boyington, who survived. Men like Lieutenant Robert Hansen, who shot down 25 Japanese aircraft in his Corsair and was killed by anti-aircraft fire the day before his 24th birthday, just days before he was due to rotate home. Men whose names appear in squadron rosters and casualty lists but aren't remembered in history books. They paid the price for establishing air superiority. Their sacrifices made possible the amphibious operations that rolled back Japanese conquests island by island. But measured against what would have happened without the Corsair, without the tactical innovations that made it effective, the losses were acceptable. That sounds cold. Calculated. But war is about mathematics as much as heroism. If American pilots had continued flying the way they flew in early 1943, trading aircraft roughly 1-for-1 with Japanese fighters, the casualty lists would have been exponentially longer. The timeline to victory would have stretched. More Marines would have died on invasion beaches without adequate air support. The Corsair, properly employed, saved American lives by taking the fight to the enemy and winning decisively. The legacy continues. When modern fighter pilots study tactics at weapons schools around the world, they study the same principles that Corsair pilots discovered. When engineers design new fighters, they build in the performance characteristics that make vertical tactics possible. High thrust-to-weight ratios, structural strength to handle high-G maneuvers, excess power to convert speed back into altitude. The Corsair proved that these characteristics matter more than pure maneuverability. That lesson has been validated in every air war since World War II. The F-86 Sabre that achieved air superiority over Korea used energy tactics against the more maneuverable MiG-15. The F-4 Phantom that fought in Vietnam succeeded when pilots used vertical tactics and failed when they tried to turn with more agile opponents. The F-15 Eagle, with its incredible thrust-to-weight ratio and climb performance, dominates through energy management. The F-22 Raptor, the most advanced fighter ever built, is designed specifically to maintain energy state advantages that deny opponents the ability to engage on their terms. Every one of these aircraft traces its tactical lineage back to the Corsair and the Marines who figured out how to use it. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Corsair's story is how close it came to never happening. If the Navy had insisted on better carrier landing characteristics before accepting the aircraft, development might have been delayed by years. If the Marines had tried to use the Corsair like a wildcat, fighting horizontal engagements, the aircraft's advantages would have been wasted. If pilots hadn't been willing to break with traditional fighter doctrine and try something radically different, the vertical tactics might never have been developed. Any one of those failures would have changed the history of the Pacific War. But the Navy did pass the Corsair to the Marines, and Marine pilots did experiment with new tactics, and men like Pappy Boyington did have the vision and the courage to implement those tactics, even when traditional doctrine said they were wrong. The result was a fighter aircraft that achieved combat results that seemed impossible, an 11-to-1 kill ratio, the lowest loss rate of any fighter in the Pacific, air superiority so complete that by war's end, Japanese fighters often refused to engage. Those results came from the combination of excellent engineering, sound tactics, aggressive employment, and pilots willing to take risks. The bent-wing bird with the massive engine and the distinctive silhouette became an icon. It appeared in newsreels and war bond posters. It inspired a television series in the 1970s that introduced a new generation to the Black Sheep Squadron and Pappy Boyington's exploits. Museums around the world preserve Corsairs, restored to flying condition, or displayed as artifacts of a war that reshaped the world. But the real legacy isn't the preserved aircraft or the popular culture references, it's the doctrine. The understanding that fighter combat is about energy management, about using your advantages and refusing to fight where you're disadvantaged, about being aggressive but calculated in how you employ that aggression. That doctrine, refined through combat over the Solomons, tested over Rabaul and Bougainville, proven through hundreds of engagements where Corsairs dove from altitude at 430 miles per hour and destroyed enemy aircraft that couldn't match their speed or structural strength, remains the foundation of American fighter tactics. The aircraft changed, the speeds increased, the weapons became missiles instead of machine guns, but the fundamental principles stayed the same. And when modern fighter pilots achieve air superiority, when they dominate opponents through superior tactics and proper employment of their aircraft's capabilities, they're using lessons learned 80 years ago by Marines flying Corsairs against Zeros. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.